2/3 of Americans have experienced at least one ACE. When you look at the cost to society, 14.1 trillion per year in the US.
What? Dr. Nadine Burke Harris is an award winning physician, researcher, and advocate dedicated to addressing adverse childhood experiences, which include traumatic childhood events or unstable environments. She was appointed as California's first ever Surgeon General by Governor Gavin Newsom in 2019 and led the state's COVID-19 pandemic response.
My mom had an untreated mental health disorder. She also had paranoid schizophrenia. I remember what that's like to have something scary. The chances that it's not affecting your relationships, your parenting, your health is really low. So you're not broken at all, but you are vulnerable. How do I set my vulnerable little self up for success?
What advice do you have for people who want to heal but are afraid to dig into their past?
Great question.
Welcome to Light Within. We are so excited you're here.
But before we dive in, we'd love to ask you for a quick favor. We're a brand new podcast, and your hitting subscribe would mean the world to us. So please take a moment to hit subscribe, like, comments, and help our team bring this amazing content to you every single week. Thank you. And now back to the episode.
Dr. Burke Harris, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. We're so honored to have you as the first Surgeon General at California. And most importantly, for your research and spreading awareness of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Before we get into discussing the science behind that, we would love to truly get to know about your upbringing and how you got so passionate about ACEs.
I kind of came a little backwards into ACEs. I really did not learn about it when I was in medical school or in residency. It was kind of after I finished my pediatrics training at Stanford. And I am really passionate about serving vulnerable communities and addressing health disparities. So I opened a clinic in a very underserved neighborhood in San Francisco. And I was just caring for all of these kids, and they were having really serious challenges. Probably one of the most common things that I was seeing was kids having trouble with learning and behavior. Like a lot of them were diagnosed with ADHD and they were on multiple medications, and I was trying to figure out how to provide them with the best care. What I was seeing was that a lot of my kids who had the biggest health challenges, they also had the biggest challenges at home. Were growing up with a parent who was struggling with an untreated mental health disorder or a substance dependence, or they were witnessing violence at home or the community, or they had been victims of violence. And I think that probably one of the most striking examples was I cared for a 7-year-old boy, and I wrote about this in my book. I cared for the 7-year-old boy who had been the victim of just a really horrible situation. So he had experienced the assault at age 4 and had stopped growing. And so I started looking into all the research and the data about how could a trauma like that cause a child to stop growing. And that's really how I came across this research on adverse childhood experiences and how it affects kids' developing brains and bodies. I think that if it was just any old pediatrician and I was seeing these kids who were having lots of challenges, it might not have had such a profound impact on my professional trajectory. The other kind of big moment for me professionally in understanding the impact of ACEs was I was taking care of siblings and I was doing a physical exam for them because they were entering foster care. And as I was reading their file, and it said that Their mom had untreated paranoid schizophrenia, and that she had driven with these 2 kids, a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, with them in the back seat. She had driven into a building. And I remember thinking to myself, "My God, what must that have felt like for them?" My mom had untreated mental health disorder. She also had paranoid schizophrenia. I remember what that's like. As a doctor, I went from that heart pounding feeling to be that heart pounding feeling is a surge of adrenaline, which is a catecholamine. And what is the effect on blood pressure and heart rate? So when I was reading the research that shows that when kids experience high doses of adversity, that it increases their risk for things like heart disease or stroke or cancer, or that increases the risk for depression or other mental health disorders. For me, it was a combination between, ugh, I know what that feels to like, what is that? What causes that biological response? What's behind that? What aspects of that we can do something about? So that's what got me into this topic.
And I'm curious, when you're in medical school, what about ACEs were taught slash known?
I will say, despite my spectacularly youthful appearance, I finished medical school in 2001, which is now 24 years ago. I didn't learn anything about ACEs. The ACE study was published, the original Kaiser CDC study was published in 1998. And then just to level set for you guys, that study asked adults. So this was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And they asked 17,500 adults about their histories of 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences. So those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent had mental health disorder, substance dependence, incarceration, where there was parental separation or divorce, or intimate partner violence. So those were the 10 traditional ACEs that was asked in the ACE study. And then what they found was number one, turns out these things are super common. So 2/3 of Americans have experienced at least one. And the second thing that they found was that the more categories of these ACEs that a person has experienced, the greater the risk to their health. So the greater the likelihood of things like heart disease or stroke or autoimmune disease or mental health disorders like depression or anxiety or behavioral health disorders like substance dependence. And so that was pretty groundbreaking. But I didn't learn any of that in med school. I literally learned it when I was caring for patients in the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood of San Francisco. And I was, what's the connection between the adversity that I'm seeing my kids experience and these like high rates of ADHD and asthma and, all of these other health disorders?
That's such a inspiring story because it's not something that was taught. You saw how it was affecting people in a real world situation and you decided, "Hey, I need to research this because this is not healthy. It's not right. We need to do something about it."
I saw this. I literally went around. I was, okay, so what are we doing about this?
Yeah.
And it was like a resounding silence. I think that was a place where I was just, okay, well, we can't know this and not do anything. We got to do something. So if we don't know what to do, then for me, I felt like, okay, we got to figure out what we're going to do. It was really diving into the research, looking in the science. And one thing that it's important to know about me is that I am a second generation science nerd. So my dad got his PhD in organic chemistry. I grew up my whole life seeing the world through a very molecular lens. So when I read the ACE study and saw, okay, exposure to adversity in childhood increases the risk for all of these different health conditions throughout life. all the way from infancy to old age. What's the biology behind it? What's the mechanism? And that was a piece that was fascinating to me. So, what we now understand is that any one of us experiences something like stressful or scary or traumatic, it activates our stress response, right? So, that's normal. That's how it's supposed to work. And we release lots of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol that helps to increase our heart rate. It helps to open up our airways so we actually take in more oxygen. The part of your brain, it's called the amygdala, that actually sounds the alarm, your brain's fear center. It actually sends projections to the part in the front of your brain that's responsible for judgment and impulse control and executive functioning, and it turns it way down. Because the last thing you want when you're, like, getting ready to fight a bear is some impulse control getting in the way of survival. It turns up a part of the brain. It's called the noradrenergic nucleus of the locus ceruleus, but I like to call it the part of the brain responsible for, I don't know karate, but I do know crazy. This is our within the brain stress response center, and it gets us amped up. And then the other thing that happens when you activate your stress response is that you also activate your immune response. Because if you're fighting a bear and he gets his claws into you, you actually want your immune system to bring lots of inflammation to stabilize that wound. So this is brilliant. This is what our bodies were designed for, evolved over millennia to save our lives from a mortal threat. But the problem is what happens when that gets activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being life saving or adaptive to maladaptive or health damaging. So the biological stress response can actually lose the ability to turn itself off normally. What's really important is, especially when you're a kid, remember our brains and bodies are developing. So when you have this prolonged activation of the stress response, when you're a kid, when your brain and body are developing, it actually affects the way our brains and bodies develop. And that's what increases the risk for adverse health outcome throughout the lifetime.
Wow. So, just to sum it up for our listeners, as a child, you have these ACEs, these
Mhm.
rough experiences that impacts your psychological body and stress and all of your systems permanently.
One of the things that we're learning more and more about is that there are ways to mitigate these harms, right? But it does lead to long-term changes in brain structure and function, and then also the structure and function of the immune system, the hormonal system, even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. That prolonged stress response that leads to these changes is known as the toxic stress response.
When I first learned about the impact of ACEs, I think what stuck out to me was how many of the ACEs I also qualified for. I mean, I grew up as an immigrant, divorced parents, single mother, not knowing English growing up, things like that. But I didn't really see my childhood as traumatic childhood necessarily. But what ACEs have taught us is that even emotional neglect or something that could be seemingly small could have a profound impact in our long-term health. Would you please actually remind us what the ACEs are and help people kind of realize maybe they may have experienced that as well?
One of the things that happened when I read about ACEs and learned about ACEs was, as a clinician, as a pediatrician, I started screening my patients for ACEs, asking questions about these 10 criteria: the physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where there was parental mental health disorder, parental substance dependence, intimate partner violence, parental separation or divorce, or parental incarceration. And what I found was that about 12% of the patients that I cared for in my clinic had four or more of those ACEs. So, one of the things that we understand is that the impact of ACEs, they add up. So the more that you have, the greater the risk. And part of the reason why we started screening is because the same way that this science that shows that the more ACEs you have, the greater your risk. The science also shows that things like safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments are protective. It also shows that things like mindfulness, like meditation, can help to regulate the stress response. It also shows that things like exercise or spending time in nature, all of these things can help to regulate the stress response. One of the things that I think is really key when people learn about ACEs is to recognize, oh, you know what? Because of what I've experienced, my stress response may be a little overactive. How does that show up for me? Or it may be overactive in certain circumstances. What are the interventions that I can do that really help to regulate my stress response to help to reduce some of that health risk?
We have a lot of parents who listen to this podcast. How would a parent be able to screen for ACEs, with their child?
So, one of the things that I really recommend is that the parent or caregiver really talk about ACEs with their healthcare provider. But I think it's really helpful when we're learning about ACEs to get some support around it. There are lots of different resources where family can go online, for example, and see the ACE questions and take the ACE test. A parent who's looking for resources, one really good online resource is numberstory.org. And you can kind of go on and take the test and learn the story of your number and understand as a parent how you can keep from handing down your ACEs to your kids. So be protective. But I really, really recommend that folks talk to their doctor about it because obviously, when we understand that ACEs increase health risk, then talking with a doctor around how we can protect our health and well being is really important.
I see. So it's really about parents having that awareness of how ACEs can affect them as well as their children and, reaching out for support, whether that's their primary caregiver or looking at resources.
Other really important things that I think for parents is really recognizing their own ACEs. A lot of the time as parents, we want to focus on our kids' ACEs. But one of the really important things is recognizing how our own ACEs may affect our parenting or may affect what I call relational health. So, one of the things that just on a very personal level in my own life, because of some of my own experiences, there's no better proving ground for poking all those buttons that are really sensitive than your marriage. I've got ACEs, my husband's got ACEs, and there are ways in which how he reacts to his ACEs or how I react to my ACEs really buck up on each other. And this is a place where I think that if I didn't know about that ACEs can impact how I relate to my husband, I might actually be divorced right now. If we didn't figure out, I get real triggered around this thing and I really need to get support for myself. So I need to do my own therapy. I need to have my own mindfulness practice. I need to do my workouts and all of the things for my own mental well being. And then also the times where I'm looking at my husband, whom I love, who is the love of my life. There's something going on here. It seems like you're super triggered. So I'm just going to take a little space. I'm going to hold my boundaries, but I'm just de escalate this situation.
Thank you for sharing that because I think that was the turning point in my relationship as well with my fiance, understanding that nothing's wrong with us. We just experienced things growing up and it shapes us in certain ways. Some of them, now our bodies over responds to certain triggers. And it doesn't mean we're, completely broken. We can work through them through things like therapy, through mindfulness practices. And as long as we have that understanding that both of us are broken, we're both healing and we're committed to healing, I think that's been a really more powerful thing to do together, to be on a journey together.
Right, because it not only allows you to have empathy for your partner, it allows you to have empathy for yourself. And what I like to talk about it is not even that you're broken, because your body is responding the way that our bodies were designed to respond. So you're not broken at all, but you are vulnerable. There's this weird paradox because I've heard from a lot of people that learning about ACEs, at first it feels a little scary, right? Like, oh my gosh, I'm more vulnerable. If you take that like to the next step and you're okay, I am more vulnerable. So what does that mean about how I need to support myself? What does that mean about the type of support I need from my partner? And turning that what feels like a weakness into a strength. Recognizing my vulnerability feels scary because, ugh, I'm more vulnerable. But it's, oh, you mean I can use that then to understand how do I set my vulnerable little self up for success? And that's been really powerful.
Yeah, this is so relevant because I am working through my own childhood experiences right now, and therapy has been wonderful for me. What are some of the most effective healing practices you've seen in action?
So if we're talking about for adults, I am a big fan of therapy. That's number one. A really big fan of mindfulness, especially meditation. One of the things that has also been incredibly helpful for me, I started doing EMDR at a particular time where I needed more support around some really deeper, more fundamental triggers. I personally found EMDR to be incredibly helpful. The most important thing about the therapeutic intervention, and this is something that it's important for people to understand. When we talk about therapy, it really has to be trauma focused therapy. So there's lots of different types of trauma focused therapy, but not all therapy is trauma focused. So it is very possible to see a therapist and be in therapy for years, if not decades, and not doing any work on the actual trauma. Recognizing and working to desensitize your triggers, I think, is a really important part of rewiring your nervous system to respond differently to the same stimulus that might trigger you otherwise.
How would our listeners know if they're in therapy right now that they are receiving trauma focused therapy versus not? And if they're not, what can they do to find that trauma focused therapy?
The best way is just to talk to your therapist. Talk to your therapist, and you can ask them if they have trauma focused interventions, or if you say, hey, I really want to work on addressing my trauma or addressing my triggers. And if they're not trained, should refer you to a therapist who does have trauma training. And that is fairly standard practice.
I can also affirm that EMDR has been absolutely transformative for my mental health for both trauma from the past as well as more recent traumas as well. And for those who are not familiar, EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. As far as I know, it's kind of becoming the gold standard for trauma treatment, especially for PTSD. Is there anything more that you would like to share about EMDR, whether how it personally affected you or the science behind EMDR?
Sure. It's really interesting. As a pediatrician, I've looked into this a little bit because I'm a super science nerd and I don't fully understand the biological mechanisms behind it. If it's demonstrated to be effective, that's the thing that's really important to me. It was actually my research into this topic and just kind of reading some of the data behind it and seeing some of the clinical efficacy in treating trauma symptomatology that actually got me into thinking, oh my gosh, maybe I should try it. And my own personal experience with it has been very positive. Really just taking the teeth out of some of these triggers, particularly improving, for me, relational health. It really made an impact in my relationship to be able to respond differently to some of the sticky points.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. It might not be mentioned in ACEs as one of the 10 categories, but relational issues are quite literally emotional traumas that kind of pile up over time throughout all of our lives. And unless you take measures to really work on them through practices like EMDR, it kind of stays with you forever and makes your triggers worse and worse over time. Is that something you've experienced as well in your life?
So, one of the things I think it's important for folks to understand is that neurons that fire together wire together. So, when we have, particularly, for example, emotional trauma or neglect or things like that, that activate these intense stress responses, and then as an adult, you have something that triggers that same thing, you get the same kind of flood of physiologic responses. That's a big way in which our emotional experiences and emotional states can trigger this whole biological response. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we think about it as emotions, but there's this super strong brain body connection. The body does not stop at the neck. That's part of the reason why things like regular exercise or even anti-inflammatory diet can be helpful for us in regulating our mood and regulating our responses. But also this piece of identifying the triggers and building, I like to call it a toolkit. What are the things that can really help support me when my system is really getting activated? And one of the opportunities, I think things like trauma focused therapy allow us to be able to do is then start wiring a different circuit. So having some of those neurologic pathways, we can take advantage of some of the forms of neuroplasticity that are lifelong to be able to wire in a different way of responding to things.
And for people who might not be as familiar, how bad exactly are ACEs or emotional trauma? How bad could that be?
One thing that's really important to recognize is that ACEs increase the risk for long term physical, mental, behavioral, and relational health disorders. The impact is cumulative. So the more you have, the greater the risk. But there's also one piece that's really important, and that is in absence of adequate buffering caregiving systems. And it's a little tricky because you need a lot of supportive buffering systems to reduce the effect of the harm. Like if something really traumatic happens, you need to pile on a lot of nurturing buffering systems. What we learned from the ACE study was that, just as an example, an individual with 4 or more ACEs has double the risk for heart disease, number one killer in the US, about 2.5 times the risk for chronic liver disease as compared to someone with 0 ACEs, 4.5 times the risk for depression as compared to someone with 0 ACEs, and about 7 to 10 times the risk of substance dependence, depending on the type of substance. So, number one, what the science shows is that early detection and early intervention improves outcomes. That's super clear. Looking at that science and understanding that's a big part of the reason why California invested in training for our primary care clinicians to screen for ACEs, to identify those who are at high risk of having a dysregulated stress response, and then respond with evidence based trauma informed care. So that's one piece. But the other thing that the research shows is that it's never too late to be doing healing interventions. And so when we do things like mindfulness practices or mental health interventions or exercise or nutrition or time in nature or safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, that can reduce some of those risks.
What advice do you have for people who want to heal but are afraid to dig into their past and learn about their ACEs?
Yeah, that's so common. And I think that when it comes to trauma, trauma is something that is treatable. That fear or that shame is the thing that perpetuates these behaviors, these reactions. For so many people who say, I don't want to look at this because I'm afraid. I don't want to look at this because I feel ashamed. What I would say is that step 1, being able to get to that place of vulnerability to say, "This experience that I had, it really may have affected me in ways that are impacting me now," because the chances that it's not affecting your relationships, your parenting, your health is really low. Really, really, really low. And so being able to recognize it is probably, I think, one of the most important things to do something different.
Yeah, this is so powerful because moved to the US without knowing how to speak any English, had divorced parents. I thought none of that affected me. And looking at it now, of course it affected me. It was a lot more traumatic or a lot more impactful than I thought. And by ignoring it for so long, it actually impacted all of my relationships, my health, my mental health,
Right.
everything.
Right.
And once I was able to really be honest with myself,
Mhm.
remove that fear, that shame, that guilt, do the work within therapy, being vulnerable with others, I can honestly say my life has been transformed. And even how I relate to others. And my friends can see it, my family can see it. I just want to say it's so worth it to really take that next step, even if it's scary or hard, to work on yourself because your life could be so much better than you ever imagined.
Right. So this is the fascinating thing because I see a lot of people who said, "Oh yeah, I had a ton of aces, but they didn't affect me." Right? When folks start to be able to explore that a little bit, I think a lot of people have the experience that you had in being able to see, wow. And one of the things that I think is really important, and this is something that I find very empowering about the ACE science, is that there are a lot of people who feel, oh, if it's impacting me, it must be because I'm broken or it must be because I'm weak. As a physician, because of what you experienced, there are changes in the way that your body was wired. Like it's changes in the way the amount of stress hormones your body makes. This is what our bodies were designed to do. There's literally nothing wrong with you, but there can be long term impacts that affect your well being, your relationships, your health. And that's something that we can do something about in a way that can really benefit your health, benefit your relationships, all of the things.
I always wanted to be strong, being an immigrant and being the first son, actually, supporting my mother. I didn't want to be weak. I would always brush things off. That results in health issues and relationship issues that I experienced tremendously, especially in the past few years. Almost like I had to like force myself and like just surrender. Hey, I need to accept my childhood self for what he went through and start to just heal. I hope that more and more people can start the journey as well.
One of the things that happens when we know that safe and stable and nurturing relationships and environments are protective against the impacts of childhood adversity, when you leave your culture, your country, your community, all of your relationships, and you come to a place where you have to totally navigate that in a new way, you don't have a lot of these protective factors that can prevent experiences of adversity from leading to harm. So you as a kid don't have the auntie who might look out for you. If your mom is struggling and having a rough time, you're just much less likely to have those other folks. In our experience, coming to the US, we really didn't have those folks who could step in. I want to recognize that some folks, their experience of immigration is a traumatic, but that can also make it more difficult and increase risks.
One of the most important things we can do is to raise awareness of this, both for parents and their own healings, and for their children to be able to experience that safe, nurturing environment where they feel loved.
Here's the thing, when we're talking about from a public health perspective, why this is important to raise awareness and share with people, the CDC did an analysis of the cost of ACEs to the United States. A certain percentage of it was what are the healthcare costs associated with treating the heart disease and the diabetes and the autoimmune disease and all of these things where we see increased risk of ACEs, substance dependence, depression, et cetera. So that was a small portion, but the vast majority of it was what is the lost productivity? If someone experiences, for example, depression or substance dependence, and they're no longer able to work, so they're not paying taxes anymore. If you look at incarcerated populations, upwards of 90% have a lot of ACEs. So when you look at the cost to society, what's your guess on what that number was annually per year for the United States?
$10 billion.
100 billion?
I worked with health economists to calculate the cost of ACEs for California alone for 1 year. Our calculation was 112.5 billion. That was published when I was state surgeon general, and that was actually part of how we were able to implement a public health approach to addressing ACEs in California. The CDC just did this analysis, and they got IRS data, Department of Justice data, Department of Education data, 14.1 trillion per year in the US.
What?
Yeah, I know. I know. That's a lot of money. So I'm going to say most of that 13 point something trillion is lost productivity. This is why when we talk about taking public health approaches, we for sure need to take a public health approach. This is something that is a public health crisis. We're talking about 2/3 of Americans have experienced at least one ACE. Roughly 1 in 6 Americans have experienced 4 more ACEs. That's a lot of people. And it's costing us a lot of money. So the work that both of you have done and are doing right now is literally preventing ACEs in your kids. Now, what's really exciting is that, number one, more and more doctors are learning about how to screen for ACEs. And California launched this big ACEs Aware initiative. And more public health agencies are raising awareness so that people can understand, oh, okay, ACEs may be impacting my health. And so what can I do about it? How can I double down on my protective factors? How can I do interventions that will help to regulate my stress response? But this is something that everyone has a role to play. Healthcare, law enforcement, education, even housing. There are folks who are designing public spaces in a way that are more therapeutic and kind of support having a more holistic approach. Once you recognize what a big problem ACEs are, there are so many opportunities for intervention. There are workplaces that are trying to be more trauma informed and thinking about how they can support their employees, right? And this is what we need. We need every sector kind of leaning in to address this issue.
You have an incredible success of being appointed California's first Surgeon General. What was your experience when COVID hit?
As a person who loves public health and loves public service, the COVID pandemic was really intense, and it was a lot of work. I will say that my husband did bedtime for our kids literally every night for 2 years. So, yes, thank you, Arno Harris. I felt grateful to have the opportunity to serve and be part of the solution. And particularly, it was really important to me that the interventions that we were doing and that I was part of leading in California was improved health outcomes for everyone. So, one of the things that can happen when you have a public health emergency is that the folks who have the most resources, or the folks who are English speaking, or the folks who can work remotely, they're protected, they're more protected, and so we had all of these really vulnerable communities who were experiencing COVID at a greater rate, like having greater rates of disease and death, and California did a lot to make sure that we had an equitable COVID response, and I was really, really proud of that work. But the funny thing that happened around COVID was we launched the ACEs Aware initiative in California in January of 2020, and then in March, we issued these remain at home orders. And there was a moment in that process where we were working with some consultants, and one of the consultants said, "Should we pause on ACEs Aware to focus on COVID response?" And I was just, we have this huge infectious disease emergency, which is a massive stressor. Everybody's worried. Then we are now issuing remain at home orders. A lot of people are not going to work. Kids aren't going to school. And for some households, it was kind of this wonderful little oasis. But for some households, it really wasn't. It was just this massive stressor. And if you have a massive stressor and you have a dysregulated stress response, there's going to be increased risk of harm. I was just, no, we need to move this forward because this is COVID response. And training our doctors and our clinicians on how to recognize a dysregulated stress response and treat stress related health outcomes with evidence based interventions actually turned out to be absolutely invaluable. I had one clinician said that before COVID, he was, yeah, I heard about this ACEs stuff, and I guess I should probably be screening. And I guess I should understand what are the interventions that can help to regulate someone's stress response. And then after COVID hit, he's like, every day, almost every patient, I am dealing with someone who needs an intervention to help to regulate their stress response. Oh my God, I'm so glad I did the ACEs Aware training. It was actually pretty amazing. Yeah.
What was some of the magnitude of the impact that you had on ACEs training?
So in California, we trained more than 46,000 healthcare providers on how to screen for ACEs so far since 2020. And more than 3 million screens have happened in California. More than a third of California's kids on Medicaid have been screened for ACEs. Massive. I just have to say, for like a public health initiative, that's absolutely huge. Here's what else is amazing. Kaiser Permanente, which is the health system that first pioneered the ACE study, when California launched reimbursement for ACE screening, it was really with Medicaid. So Medicaid is usually for kids and low income. And Kaiser really took this leadership role and they said, listen, we don't have the hugest number of Medicaid patients, but we're going to do this because we understand this is the right thing to do. So in the Kaiser clinics, they've screened, I want to say, more than 180,000 pregnant moms for ACEs. So Kaiser's a place where they're really pioneering ACE screening at prenatal visits for a couple of different reasons. Number one, because we know that mom's ACEs can actually impact her pregnancy risk. So that's one thing that is really important. But the other piece of it is that it's this incredible opportunity to break the intergenerational transmission. What a better time to be like, I haven't dealt with it before, but let me just take a moment to really explore my own ACEs and get the support that I need when I'm getting ready to have a baby. So it's exciting.
I just want to thank you and applaud you for the impact you've had on all of us and our future generation. You fundamentally changed the way the healthcare system thinks about something like ACEs at that scale is so hard to do. It's not just telling people you should do this. It goes so much more than that. So I know how much hard work you put into making this happen. We gotta convince the American government to, give you a few $1 trillion to solve this problem.
The work that I'm doing with my team now is actually helping to support other states that are interested in doing kind of rolling out early detection and early intervention. Because number one, the science is super clear that that improves outcomes, but we understand the cost, both financially and the human toll that it takes on folks. And here's what's wild, there's so much low hanging fruit. We just haven't taken a public health approach to breaking the intergenerational cycle of ACEs. So I think that there's a tremendous amount that we can do. And it honestly, I don't know if you can tell, but it is literally my joy. Like to be able to get out of bed in the morning and say, you know what I'm going to do today? I am going to help make sure that states are putting in resources for early detection, early intervention, help folks understand how ACEs may be impacting their health, their well-being, their relationships, and break those cycles.
Yeah.
I can't think of a better reason to get out of bed.
You're one of the Avengers.
Oh my God, that's so fantastic.
I would love to talk more about your book, The Deepest
Oh,
Well.
yeah.
Could you share more about how it came to be, what it's about?
I did a TED Talk in 2014 about ACEs and toxic stress. I think it's maybe almost 12 million people have seen it by now. And then after my TED Talk came out, someone reached out to me and was like, you need to write a book. And I was like, what? It was really funny, actually. I was like, I need to write a book like I need a hole in the head. But then they were like, no, 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 listen, your TED Talk was great. Help people understand how ACEs impact us, what they are, how they impact us, what they can do about it. This is your opportunity to get some real intimate time with people and share this information. And so that's what I did when I wrote The Deepest Well. I was really sharing real stories of my actual patients and just kind of a little bit of my story of discovering, of understanding how all this works, and then what we can do about it. What are some of the interventions that help to regulate the stress response? And then also why it's so important for us to be doing early detection and early intervention. So I had so much fun writing that book. And I am now in the process of writing my second book. Writing a book takes a long time, but maybe sometime next year I'll be out with another book that's really talking about when we understand the impact of ACEs and toxic stress, and we understand some of the things. The Deepest Well is really focused on the individual. What do we do on the individual level? And then my next book will be really focused on how do we transform our systems? How do we make sure that everyone gets access to early detection or early intervention?
Do a preview of any highlights you'd be willing to share?
Essentially, it's like what I learned by being the Surgeon General of California during COVID about how we tackle a public health crisis. Some of it is really around how it has to be all hands on deck. It can't be, oh, this is the purview of one small group, just the therapists or just the doctors or just the educators. We all have a role to play. If you're a parent, if you're a police officer, if you're a judge, if you're a grandparent, if you're an auntie, if you're a person, you have an important role to play. And then also, the science will tell us safe, stable, and nurturing relationships are healing, or mindfulness can help to regulate your nervous system and reduce the fight or flight response. We know all that stuff. But then also, a lot of our systems are designed to make that as difficult as possible. Maybe not designed, but the outcome of our systems is make some of these things more difficult than they need to be. How can we transform our systems to actually give folks a fighting chance to implement some of the interventions that we know make a difference?
I mean, you have such a unique story and experience that I just know this book is going to be a hit and it's going to help so many people.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm excited for it. It's a lot of fun.
When your next book launches, we'll make sure to have you on again and then share about the book
Oh my
more.
God. Please. Thank you. I got to write it first. I'm like still writing it. It's a lot of work.
Life is so funny how you had no idea you'd be writing a book and now you're already writing your second book.
I know. It's like childbirth. Writing a book is really hard. And then after you hand in the book, you're like, I'm never going to do that again. And then like 2 years later, you're like, oh, was it that bad? You forget. The point is that the outcome is so great. That's the piece of it. One of the things that I feel really proud of is as I go and I speak in various places or wherever, I still hear folks say, wow, your book really changed my life. It changed the way I teach. It changed my professional trajectory. It changed the way I think about myself. It changed my marriage. Like all of that stuff, it just makes me feel fantastic.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd just love to encourage every single listener here to pick up your book, Deep as well, and just share about ACEs among your friends, your family, to your children, and really start that journey of spreading a safe, nurturing place for everyone else.
What I really love about what you said earlier is everyone can make an impact. Whether you're a grandparent, police fighter, teacher, parent, like anyone can make an impact if you're a human. So yeah, I just really love how inclusive that is and how empowering it is for us to know, we can do something about this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's how we're going to do it. You don't have to boil the ocean. You just have to play your position. And each of us has a role to play.
If you'd like to share one advice for our listeners to help them rediscover the light within themselves, what would that be?
Really just having empathy for themselves and embracing their vulnerability.
I needed that.
There's so much to those few words, so have everyone just press pause and think about that a little bit more. Thank you for sharing that. Where can people learn more about your work and your book?
On my website, nadineburkeharris.com, they can learn more about my work, my book, my speaking events. I'm not a huge social media person, but I like throw out little self-care tidbits and share if I'm going to be speaking somewhere or anything like that. I put it all on Insta.
Incredible. We'll make sure to add those links in the show notes.
Well, thank you so much for being here. You've shared so much wisdom with us today, and we're so grateful to have you on this podcast.
Well, it has really been my joy. Thanks for having me on. And thank both of you for using your voices and your platform to promote this healing journey that we all need to be on.
Thanks so much, Nadine.
Thank
Sure.
you. Thank you so much for watching. Hope that resonated with you.
If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and leave your thoughts and comments.
Your support means the world to us and helps us bring these conversations to you for free. We read every single comment and we would love to connect with you there. So go subscribe. Until next time, love yourself, be kind to yourself, and remember, your light is always within you.